Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
As President-elect Trump prepares for his return to the White House in January, he's letting Americans know how his second administration aims to tackle the economy and the border, posting Monday on Truth Social that he plans to impose sweeping tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China to crack down on illegal immigration and fentanyl. Meanwhile, the president-elect receiving some good news this week after the federal judge overseeing his 2020 election interference case agreed to dismiss charges without prejudice. In a post on Truth Social, President-elect Trump wrote the case was a political hijacking and a low point in the history of our country that such a thing could have happened, and yet I persevered against all odds and won, a message he's been echoing since the cases were brought against him. To discuss this and President-elect Trump's cabinet continuing to take shape, we bring in our panel. Republican strategist Colin Reed, Democratic strategist, co-host of The Five, Jessica Tarlov, and member of the Fox News Decision Desk, Daron Shaw. You know, Colin, as we get to this point, we are starting to see how this second administration is going to start, and it sounds like it's going to start pretty fast, with a lot of things in the pipeline, as well as this potential threat against tariffs if Mexico and Canada don't step up their border efforts and China doesn't stop sending fentanyl chemicals through Mexico.
Yeah, Bret, it's all been coming up roses for President-elect Trump since he got elected 3 weeks ago. It's hard to believe it's only been 3 weeks, but there it is. And look, if there's one thing that he became known for, both in the campaign trail and then as the president during the first term, it was his love of tariffs. He refers to himself as a tariff man. Interestingly enough, President Biden kept many of those same tariffs in place, so it became very difficult for Democrats to use it as a political wedge when their own party leader felt the need to keep it in place. But look, here to me, Bret, is the big difference between this iteration of the Trump presidency and the first one. And this is so unique and fascinating because we have, since the first time since 1892, a president elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. This Trump presidency is starting with more of, by virtue of having the popular vote won, by virtue of having less opposition to him, frankly, in Washington. The Democrats seem like they're really reeling. They haven't figured out an effective countermeasure. There's no nonsense about Russia collusion or his win sometimes being illegitimate. He's really got the wind at his back, and he's going to hit the ground running, unlike last time, and hopefully make use of the united control of Washington, which is so rare, and get some big things done in his first term. Look, time is very short in politics. It moves quickly. That sandbar will quickly run out of time for him. So he's got to strike while the iron's hot and while he has all this capital to play with.
Yeah, Daron, we've had some time now to digest all the election night, the votes and what people were sending, the message they were sending. What's your large 30,000-foot takeaway as new polls now suggest the American public is giving the president-elect thumbs up on this transition effort?
Well, I think there's 2 important points that you'd want to make. The first is the coalitional shifts that you saw beginning in 2016 and then ran through 2020 and into 2024 are really pretty profound. The movement of the white working class towards the Republicans, inroads with African-American, Latino voters, those are substantive. And those were, I think if you're talking about big picture things on this election, those were absolutely essential. And the interesting thing is, as Colin was sort of suggesting, can you use tariffs? Can you use sort of targeted specific policies to reinforce the sort of flirtations or, kind of initial forays into Republican territory that have been made by these voters? The second interesting piece is there are a lot of people, I'd be interested to see what Jessica says about this. It was in some ways a simple election in that you had a pretty unpopular administration, with 40% or lower approval of the president, very bad economic evaluations on the part of the public. And I think performance is going to be critical. So there's, we're kind of looking at these 2 dimensions, right? Are there specific policies to reinforce these, potential shifts in the electorate? And then can you deliver? And if you can do those two things, he may be in surprisingly good shape heading into 2026 and then the Republicans in 2028.
Yeah, Jessica, I mean, you've digested all of this and been talking about it for a couple of weeks now. Do you have one takeaway that you take from the election?
No, far be it from liberals to be able to pare it down to one takeaway.
All right, several takeaways.
Yeah, let's make this a 4-hour podcast.
Right.
I can get it to you. I would say my overwhelming feeling is that the clearest message that liberals have gotten from this is that the governance wasn't working. And I think that a lot of people, especially in these blue cities where I am in New York City, what happened all over Massachusetts and California, is that people used their vote, I think, to not necessarily affirm Donald Trump, but to send a signal to local governments that they have a problem with their quality of life and it's not being addressed properly. And that's at least what I see as the clearest signal in all of this. And I think the good news is it doesn't feel like there's a fundamental shift, like we have all suddenly become Republicans, but that these voters are saying we're up for grabs now. We can be persuaded by the people running for office that are making an argument that resonates best with me. And that's usually around the economy, which I think that we lost sight of for a little bit in terms of the campaign. And then that immigration was much more of a salient issue. And that's something I think from working in a conservative media environment that I was acutely aware of and yelling it from the rooftops. But most of the time it was falling on deaf Democratic ears as we continued to talk about a bipartisan border deal, but ignore the first 3 and change years before that. So that was probably like 8 answers to 1, but that's my
No, that's good. That's good. Colin, obviously the immigration situation and how the border will be handled is paramount to people and how security is going to be handled. I think there are a lot of questions about how deportation starts to look and does it, morph into something that liberals are afraid of and some city mayors and governors are talking about standing up to, or is it, basically criminals, terrorists at first, and they go from there?
Well, I think Jessica hit on a really important point, which is wherever you come down on the solution, most people can now agree that this current situation is broken and politics is not that complicated. If you don't like the way things are going, you throw the bums out and you give someone else a shot. And now with that election win comes the responsibility to govern. I think the shots of the shots of that 2-year-old, the border yesterday were heartbreaking and spoke volumes to what's happening at the border. I also think the visual the next day of Tom Homan, who's a man on the mission. That guy's everywhere. He's hitting the ground running before the new administration even gets sworn in, and he's relentless. And it's clear he speaks with the authority and the confidence of the president-elect. And he's someone who's got a pretty blunt, unmistakable message on border security. And one of the things I think that you'll start to see as the new administration takes hold is the federal government working with these border state governors, working with guys like Greg Abbott down in Texas and other border state governors, as opposed to standing in their way and reflexively suing them or hindering their efforts to take matters into their own hands, because ultimately this is a responsibility that rests with the federal government. So yeah, huge issue. It's one the president-elect has become associated with so much over both his runs and his presidency, and now comes the hard business of governing.
We'll continue right after this.
Yeah, now we've got Israel, Hezbollah making a deal on a ceasefire, at least for the time being, that is not Hamas, and it's not the release of hostages or what's left of the hostages, as sad as that is. Daron, do we have any sense of how that issue played in the divide in the Democratic Party with, more sympathy for the Palestinians and then the side of the Democratic Party that was more sympathetic to the Israeli plight?
Yeah, I think clearly it's emblematic of divisions within the Democratic Party. Some racial and ethnic divisions, some age divisions. Young people, racial and ethnic minorities are sort of much less attached to Israel, much more skeptical of American force projection in general. And I do think in the national numbers, foreign policy was dwarfed by the economy and immigration, as we've been talking about. But in specific places, I mean, I think you remember, Bret, Trump won Dearborn in Michigan on election night, right? And you can't look at that and not think that, was it worth a few thousand votes in Michigan? I think it clearly was. In a couple of other places, you can tell similar stories. Now the interesting task is again, we turn to governance. Can Trump say something to keep North African, Middle Eastern populations, which exist in some of these Midwestern states? Can he use sort of this entree they had to flirt with the Republicans to actually deliver on policies to get them to, become part of the Republican coalition? By the way, just as a general point, kind of building on these 10,000 or 20,000 foot perspectives, I really think it's a good thing for the country if voting doesn't break down so clearly as it had been in the past 20 years along racial and ethnic lines, that both parties have to compete for the allegiance, for the sympathies and the preferences of African American and Latino and Asian American voters. I think that's a good development this last election.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Jessica, in these swing states in which, all of the battleground states fell to Trump, 4 of them had Democratic Senate wins. So, I mean, there was a split there.
Definitely. I mean, if there has been a silver lining, that has been it. And I have been talking about it a lot on air because I think that there is often a move to kind of overcorrect and to throw the baby out with the bathwater right away. And when you look at the splits, like in Nevada, for instance, when there were 70,000 votes for Donald Trump, and then that didn't show up down ballot, there are people who walked in and just voted for Trump and then they went about their day, right? And Jackie Rosen was able to pull that out. Tammy Baldwin holding on in Wisconsin, Slotkin pulling off a big win in Michigan, which was super tight, and Ruben Gallego obviously performing really well in Arizona. So the American populace didn't writ large reject everything Democrats were selling. What they did reject was Democrats that were selling something that didn't match reality. And each of those candidates were being extremely realistic about the challenges the country was facing, about our foreign policy challenges as well. I mean, one of the super narratives throughout all of last year was that the Democrats were a completely anti-Semitic party. That's why Josh Shapiro wasn't picked as VP. Not that he actually told her that he didn't want the job, which is what it seems like it was. And then Jews performed very, very well. Looking at Slotkin, Jackie Rosen, Josh Stein in North Carolina, though it does help when you run against someone who posts on something called New to Africa a lot. But
there was that, yeah.
There was that, just a little wrinkle. Kamala got 71% of the Jewish vote, which is up to historical standards. So that narrative kind of fell away, and the common sense, real talk Democrats were able to win. Do I think that Kamala, if she had run a slightly different campaign, could have pulled it out? I'm not sure because of the global incumbency factor and how big of a deal inflation was for people. But I don't think that this means that we need to completely rebuild from the ground up. I think there were a lot of good lessons that we could take from some big wins, and on the congressional level as well, with Jared Golden, for instance, Pat Ryan's of the world. So
yeah. And, there was, just on the pure politics, Shapiro not being chosen or saying no, whichever one of that it was, is interesting in the positioning he takes now in the party as the governor of Pennsylvania and an up-and-coming star, and where he stands going into the next election. Colin, last thing, what may have been a message is identity politics is not ticking. That's just not, it's not connecting. And the woke stuff is really just making people throw their hands up.
That's right. And it became, issues like that became so front and center in terms of what Democratic candidates were talking about or what the mainstream media was projecting. And then you compare it to where it falls or ranks in the priorities of voters' concerns, and it's so far near the bottom. It was completely inverse. The amount of attention spent discussing it to where voters ranked it in terms of their listed priorities. And that's why you see that's why part of it contributed to the election results. And look, President Trump's going to come in with a sledgehammer on that particular issue because he does feel emboldened by it. And it's one where he feels as though he has the American public by and large on his side, or at least not on the side of what the other side is selling. And I expect him through a lot of his governing to reflect those priorities. But look, he's got a lot to do in a short amount of time to do it, and he's going to have to prioritize because the political capital he's amassed, he's got a lot. But today's winner is tomorrow's loser, and he's got to use it make hay while the sun is shining, because it won't forever.
Yeah, and Daron, I mean, it's roughly a year and a half, maybe 2 years, where you get to really go full court press. And Republicans, obviously, they're going to talk about a mandate, but they have some leeway. Yeah, clearly has some running room, but maybe not all that much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll zag a little on that. I think the expectation coming out of this election, and you hear this in Texas where I am a lot, is that, Trump won, but the Republicans are, set up for the traditional midterm drop-off. But I would say one thing to your audience, Bret, the surge in decline, right? That you surge in the presidential year and then you decline in the midterm. The magnitude of the decline is dependent on the magnitude of the surge. And as Jessica pointed out, the Republicans didn't win sweeping victories. They won some Senate seats. They won a few House seats. But I'll actually kind of be in the minority on this. I don't expect a huge drop-off in 2026 because there wasn't a huge surge in 2024. You look at the map, there's not that many seats out there where I think it's obvious that the Democrats can pick up. So, maybe that's another reason to be aggressive on the part of the Trump administration.
And I think there will be. Panel, thanks. Now for a bit of history. On November 17th, 1989, President George H.W. Bush began the official White House tradition of pardoning a turkey. Though past presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan had also pardoned turkeys in their day, the annual White House event did not become a tradition until President George H.W. Bush. When the president stepped out before the group of reporters, school children, and one anxious 50-pound turkey in the White House Rose Garden, he declared, "Let me assure you, in this fine Tom turkey, that he will not end up on anyone's dinner table, not this guy." He's granted a presidential pardon as of right now. Since that day, the presidential turkey pardon has remained and reminded us of the annual Thanksgiving tradition. Guys, thanks a lot. Happy Thanksgiving. For Jessica, Daron, and Colin, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.